Hi, I'm Meredith Sasseen, and I'm here with Sean Korn. We're here at Wanderlust Oahu 2014, and yesterday you gave a great class with DJ Drez. The lawn was filled with practitioners, and one of the themes that's really clear in your teaching is forgiveness. And one of our listeners asked me to ask you, at what point in your life did forgiveness really become relevant, and was there an event that took you over the edge to having it be more of a focus in your teaching?
It's a great question because forgiveness is probably the through line in every single class that I teach. It's the most important thing that I practice every single day, is the thing that I struggle with. I would imagine in the same way everyone struggles with it. And I would have to say that it came to my attention when I was around 19. 19 was really the time where everything came to a head for me. It's when I got into yoga. It's when I got into therapy. It's when I started recognizing that I had trauma that I hadn't dealt with from my childhood that needed to be dealt with. I struggled with obsessive compulsive disorder when I was younger. I was obsessed with the numbers 4s and 8s. And if things weren't done in a certain order, it would cause an enormous amount of anxiety for me. And it's one of the reasons I got into both yoga and therapy, was to try to deal with the anxiety and why I felt the need to compartmentalize and do things in such patterns. And what I learned in the experience, it had a lot to do with the need to create control, the need to create boundaries and safety for myself, to take ownership of even my own body, and that it was a survivor's reaction to trauma. And so as I got deeper into my healing journey and started to deal with some of the deeper emotions of rage and betrayal and grief, that was really what was inside my body that I wasn't allowing space for. Eventually, what it came down to, if I wanted real freedom, if I wanted true liberation, I had to see the bigger picture of why things happened as they did, what the value of those experiences were. I couldn't take away what was, but I can certainly shift my perception to it. And that learning at that time about vibration and energy and the impact that it has on the central nervous system, and that very often my patterning was being done because of almost a compulsion to tension, that for me to truly release that tension, I had to understand the emotions that were attached to it, and that I had to begin to work towards letting go of the resentment. And so forgiveness became critical in my own life. And it wasn't necessarily condoning, but I was taught that it's a poison you take hoping someone else will die. And that the patterns and the rituals that I did were just a way of masking my rage. And that for me to stop the patterns and those behaviors, I had to really go to the core. So there was a lot of grief, and there was a lot of deep inner work. And core to that inner work was letting go of my attachment to some of the things that had happened, seeing that bigger spiritual picture, and forgiving. And that's why it's so true to this day. It was instrumental in my own healing. I can't imagine that it's not instrumental in everyone's healing. And so I'm committed to that theme.
Do you see that pattern obsession alive in students or friends? Is it easily recognizable?
I can usually tell when someone has obsessive compulsive disorder. I work with a lot of people, a lot of young people who are challenged with OCD. And it's one of my favorite things to do, is to work with young people with it and to try to normalize it and help them to understand that there are ways that you can actually work through it, and that also it is such a huge part of it's a very creative part of their survival mechanism. Yeah. And I want them to celebrate that they found a very interesting way to deal, but it doesn't really serve them. So that there's kind of ways that work through it. I can spot it when I look in. I can see it in people, or the way people approach their asana practice, little things that they do with their bodies, how many times they walk their feet in, or the ways that they kind of shift their body weight from side to side. There are certain things that are indicative of some perfectionism and, subtle or sometimes severe OCD expressions. So I see it a lot.
What would be a first step for someone who feels like they're exhibiting those patterns?
Breathe. Truly breathe. What I remember it was in David Life's class, this is a gazillion years ago, and he was adjusting me. This is in New York City at Jivamukti, and he was adjusting me, and he just stepped on one of my feet, I don't know if he was pressing a heel down. but he only touched one of my feet. And this is when I was in the throes of my OCD. And I could feel the anxiety come up. I really wanted him to touch my other foot. Like, I felt very out of balance. I could feel the anxiety start to arise. There was nothing I could do to get him to step on that foot. There was no way I was going to be able to balance out my body. And so all this anxiety came up for me, and then David out of nowhere said, breathe and everything changes. And I breathed, and the anxiety came up, and then all of a sudden opened, and it went away. And I thought, well, that was interesting. And so then the next time, I lived on the 4th floor of a walk-up. Thank God I was on the 4th floor. I had a hard time because I was on the 5th. And there were 56 steps. And I would count the steps every single time. I would go down the stairs. I'd have to count those steps. And then I'd have to go back up 4 times and do this and check to make sure I locked the door, even though that door was locked. And I knew it was locked, didn't matter. And one day I got halfway down the stairs and I was counting. And I forced myself to stop counting. And just like, I forget what I don't know if I put a song in my head or something, but I stopped counting. But the anxiety came up. And I sat at the bottom of the stairs, and I knew I was going to need to go back up the stairs and do the whole thing all over again. And I just sat there, and I breathed, and I breathed, and I breathed, and I breathed. And I waited on the bottom of those stairs for I don't even know how long, like with my head in my hands, trying to deal with the anxiety of breaking the patterns. Because for me, the patterns are very much associated with if I didn't do the patterns, someone that I loved would get hurt or die. It was, you know, it's a very complex OCD. It's very diverse. I mean, it's a broad spectrum. But for me, it had a lot to do with other people's safety or survival. It was like a God complex in a lot of ways. But I sat and I breathed, and sure enough, it opened, and I actually was able to leave the apartment and not go back up and check the locks and count the steps. And it was the beginning of a lot of freedom. And so breathing was, to this day, I mean, OCD doesn't go away. I don't exhibit any of those symptoms any longer, but I will notice if I'm dealing with situations that are stressful, I can feel the impulse. I can feel it in my body. It's a very familiar sensation. So I'll take a moment and just, you know, feel my feet on the floor, kind of resource, make sure I'm in my body, and take a breath, and then it usually dissipates.
Thank you so much for sharing with the breath and forgiveness. This is Seane Corn. I'm Meredith Sasseen. We're here right on the beautiful island of Oahu at Wanderlust 2014. That's neat. I didn't know that about you.